Okay, so I talked about the thresholds. So I think the movie kind of signals that there are multiple thresholds here, and she keeps going further and further in. And almost all of them come with some kind of threshold guardian. So first, she has to get into the world of the labyrinth, and that's Jareth. So we could call him a threshold guardian. And then she's outside the labyrinth, and she has to get in the first place. And arguably, our first threshold guardian is Hoggle. He basically gives her advice on, how to get into the labyrinth in the first place, and says, it's counterintuitive and not like you would expect, which suggests a little bit more along the lines of the dreams and whatnot. That this is connecting to the subconscious. And then not too long after that, she's in the labyrinth again, but she's having trouble making any progress. She's just going in circles. So she needs to find a way to get deeper. And as she goes deeper, the nature of the labyrinth changes, and it, looks different and it feels different. So another threshold guardian is the little worm guy. Little worm basically tells her to look at things differently, and then she can start seeing the sort of doors where before she couldn't even see them. They were invisible to her, but she needs to sort of see the optical illusions. So the worm is kind of helping her get across there, and that's pretty cool. Then we just keep having these threshold guardian experiences. Let's see. Sir Didymus appears in as a threshold guardian. He's literally guarding a bridge. And so how does she manage to get past him and get him as an ally on her side? Well, she says to him, what is the exact phrasing? Basically, she points out that he's the one who's actually giving permission to people to let them cross the bridge. So all she has to do is clarify with him that she just has to ask nicely, and he can tell her, yes, you can cross the bridge. So that's pretty great. And then he becomes an ally after that. And I'm reminded of Joseph Campbell talking about the monster Sticky Hair that at first is an enemy, and then after the Buddha defeats Sticky Hair becomes an ally and the guardian of that forest. So that's pretty cool. And maybe you could make an argument for Ludo as a kind of threshold guardian, but I don't know. He doesn't really seem to be guarding the way. It's more that she kind of helps him out. So that's a little more of a standard traditional type of thing, of just making a friend along the way. But you can see how threshold guardians can become allies. And another set of threshold guardians, you have the two-headed guys. She has to figure out their riddle, which I've tried to explain it before, but I can never exactly explain it perfectly why that is the solution to the riddle. Basically she uses her wits to figure that out, and she's gaining confidence in herself. She's learning that she can solve these problems. So if part of the reason why she acts so childishly at the beginning is because she doesn't really, have a lot of confidence in herself, now she's starting to get that sense she is capable. She can deal with these problems. And another threshold guardian is the door heads. Whoop. She kind of figures out how to be clever there too. She outwits them, and she figures out that she can trick the guy into opening his mouth by plugging his nose, and so she can knock on the door and go to the next part. So there's all sorts of threshold guardians. In fact, maybe this is a movie about threshold guardians. Oh, that didn't work. There's those stone heads that say, turn back, this is not the way, and things like that. And they're trying to get her to refuse and to turn back. But they almost seem like a parody of the whole concept here of the threshold guardians, because all they do is really talk and they just want to say their lines. And then, okay, so she's gotten further and further in the labyrinth, and she finally gets to the Goblin City. So there's a threshold. Is the Goblin City, and now she's outside the walls of the city itself, which is in the middle of the labyrinth. And she has to fight. She has to deal with a couple of opponents. She has the Threshold Guardian of the basically giant knight. That's kind of actually a robot piloted by a goblin. And there she actually gets some help from her friends. So she has help from Hoggle. And Hoggle's arc throughout this has been really interesting. Sarah didn't really have a whole lot of confidence in herself. Hoggle doesn't have a whole lot of confidence in himself. And in fact, at a critical moment, I want to talk about that in a second, he betrays Sarah because he's very scared of Jareth. So Hoggle's big theme is cowardice and being a coward. And at various points, he's kind of discouraging Sarah and telling her to turn back. And this kind of connects to the idea of the refusal of the call. So Hoggle's arc over the course of the story is that he goes from being a coward to being a hero. And it's Hoggle who defeats the Threshold Guardian of the Night. And why does he do that? Because he's finally found his courage. He decides to risk it all to help Sarah because he feels guilty about betraying her. And he comes back in the 11th hour to help her out. So you can interpret this as, on the one hand, his story, but maybe also a little bit of a story about Sarah, about this story of her gaining confidence over time. Hoggle kind of works like a metaphor of, confidence and friends helping you out. And her learning to be more confident and then being able to draw on her friends. And so that works really well. And then thereafter, Hoggle is a loyal ally. I should mention one more threshold is that they're in the Goblin City, but now they have to get through the Goblin City. They have to get through the streets and get to the castle itself. So there's so many different layers here. And the opponents that they have to face are these goblin warriors. It's a long thing. It's a big part of the scene, and Sir Didymus helps out some by riding on his dog Ambrose. But even more helpful is Ludo. Because, and we see this really early on, Ludo has the power to communicate with rocks. So he helps them out by calling on the rocks in his big sort of howling or lowing monster voice. And they are ultimately the solution to defeating the goblin army. So again, she's drawing on her friends. And maybe Ludo stands for compassion. That she is, she sees Ludo's trapped and in danger, and she helps him out even though he's a scary monster. And she uses her compassion to move forward and to save the day. And Ludo has the ability to communicate. And her ability to communicate with Ludo allows Ludo to communicate with the rocks. And I should mention, that maybe Sir Didymus, what he represents is her dog, honestly, because she was out playing with her dog at the beginning, and she was kind of being impulsive about it. She didn't keep an eye on the clock, and so she has this desire to be kind of impulsive and playful. But her dog is something that she really values in her life. So maybe Sir Didymus stands for kind of the dog, kind of the importance of her dog in her life, and also that sort of these things. And Sir Didymus at a couple points is just yapping like crazy, yapping up a storm like a dog, or like Sarah not really thinking things through. Sir Didymus doesn't always think things through, but also her impulsiveness is kind of connected to her courage. So Sir Didymus plays a role there as well. So that's pretty cool. And now we've got one more, we're finally in the castle, and what do we get when we go to the very center of the castle? We have to go upstairs in the castle. And what do we find? We find a labyrinth inside the castle, inside the labyrinth. So I guess there's almost a threshold from the castle to the double labyrinth. That's more like an MC Escher painting than the sort of maze that was outside. And it's almost like at this point, the borders of reality are breaking down. Like maybe when you go deeper and deeper into your mind, you get to a point where it's very, very abstract and even more symbolic. But let's leave off talk of threshold there, because we also need to talk about her interactions with Jareth and the dark night of the soul that she experiences. This is before the Goblin City. In fact, right before the Goblin City. Basically, Jareth is intimidating Hoggle, and he asks her to Hoggle to give her a poisoned apple. And the poisoned apple is not poison in that it's going to kill her. It's more like going to put a spell on her, put her into a dream, Jareth says. It's similar to the bubbles and crystal balls that Jareth is always juggling. So it's very connected to his magic. And so the Dark Night of the Soul, or the Abyss, is kind of related to the ballroom dream that Sarah finds herself trapped in. And I think it's very interesting what that says about her relationship with Jareth. There, even though he is like this sorcerer casting a spell on her, he's also very compelling to her in a way. You know, that she is at this masquerade, you know, everybody's wearing masks, and she's one of the few people without a mask. And she's drawn into dancing with Jareth, with David Bowie, and so she's sort of enchanted with him, and by him. But there's a moment where it almost seems like she really is interested in him, even though it's very surreal and this very big spell. It also seems like there's something genuine there, and you know, people like to write a lot of fan fiction and stuff like that. But I think that's deliberate, that this is supposed to evoke something romantic. So let's hold on to that when we continue to think about our characterization of Jareth. And the ballroom dream, I think, is closely connected to the junkyard. So that's another part of the Abyss. And what happens when Sarah's in the junkyard? Well, she doesn't remember what's going on. She's confused. There's still a spell on her, and she doesn't realize what the purpose of her journey is. And she meets this weird old lady who might be another kind of threshold guardian. The junk lady is kind of like a spider almost, and she's got this big sack full of junk, and Sarah gets put back in her room. And I love the way this is done, that at first it seems like she's ended up at home, and no, then the junkyard lady just barges on in. So she's still in the labyrinth, but she doesn't really understand what's going on. And so what does it mean that Sarah's back in her childhood room? Well, she's surrounded by her teddy bears, and she's like clutching her teddy bears and her toys. And what does the old lady do? She starts handing these toys to Sarah and say, hey, remember all these things you loved when you were a kid? You should just keep them, and you should have them in as much as possible, and you should hold on to them. And they're what's important now, not any of that other stuff that you were trying to do, not that brother you were trying to save. You should value your toys more than your brother, which of course was the thing that was going on at the very beginning. Now she's trying to remember, and the lady just keeps piling more and more toys into her arms until she can't hold them all, and it's ridiculous. You know, you get the impression this lady would just bury her in toys. So Sarah finally breaks out of this, and she starts wrecking this childhood room, and she starts tearing it apart and bashes her way out, and it finally shatters like a piece of glass, and she manages to get back to the labyrinth. So in her Dark Night of the Soul involves Jareth having this power over her, and her being trapped in childhood, being trapped as a child, basically, and not really realizing that she does care about her brother, and she does want to take the responsibility to rescue him. So there's a lot going on in both these scenes that are really connected to her whole journey, and it's pretty fascinating. Okay, but we got to think about Jareth. So let's go to the revelation in the double labyrinth, or just the labyrinth, shall we call it, the center of the labyrinth. And that's what we'll talk about in the next video.